Well, good evening, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues and our mutual congregations, I'm Rabbi Victor Appel from Temple Emanu-El in Westfield. And it's my pleasure to be with you this evening as we observe Tisha B'Av tonight through both study and prayer. I'm going to now turn it over to Rabbi Paul Kerbel to give us some words of introduction and begin our teaching.
Erev Tov, good evening, everyone. As the sun goes down and we're headed toward the last 50 minutes or so of Tisha B'Av, we thought it would be great to join together tonight at the end and share some reflections and thoughts. You've all seen the theme for this evening, so I'm just going to set the stage, and then each of our clergy is going to say a few words of learning and teaching. So the first thing I want to say about Tisha B'Av is, in a certain sense, we shouldn't be here. When King David conquered Jerusalem, he conquered it from the people called the Jebusites. If you look in the traditional prayer book, in the morning service, there's a whole list of the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, all these ancient peoples that no longer exist. And the Roman Empire doesn't exist. The Babylonian Empire doesn't exist. And yet here we are. And but in a certain sense, we shouldn't be here, because everything that we did and everything we believed was centered around the temple in Jerusalem and sacrifices. We didn't have a prayer book yet. We didn't have the Talmud yet. We didn't have books of mitzvot. It was pilgrimage to the temple. It was sacrifices. It was the priests and the Levites. And it was praying to God through offering incense and sacrifices. And yes, there were a few prayers recited. We know that there were Psalms recited. We know that the Ten Commandments actually in those days were recited at the temple. So we should have died out when our temple was destroyed. We rebuilt it, then we built another one, and then 70 AD, the Romans completely destroyed the temple. They exiled the Jews. And it's only because the Romans, in a certain sense, allowed some Jews to go to northern Israel, some of the rabbis, that Judaism continued on there. Of course, it continued on in a very rich history in Babylonia. It continued on as Jews moved into Europe following the expulsion from Jerusalem. But it's the wisdom of the rabbis to take a defeated people and transform us into a new people, a people based on commandments, mitzvot, on study, and on prayer. We didn't have a prayer book yet. It took many centuries, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. The oldest existing prayer book that we have today in any rare book room is from the 8th century, for instance, from the Gaons of Babylonia, right? So it took all those centuries for Judaism to develop. And that's why we're here today. We're here because we were able to take the defeat and the massive destruction and turn it into a different type of Judaism. I also want to point out that some of us, watch on TV when a famous building is imploded, baseball and football stadiums that even if they're only 30, 40 years old, have been imploded, destroyed. We watch them on the evening news. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was more than that, because it was the center of our entire religion. And we not only lost the temple, we lost Jerusalem, and we lost our sovereignty. We did not have sovereignty again until 1948, when the State of Israel was created. So if you think about it, it's amazing that we're here. The other comment I want to make about Tisha B'Av is that Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the great leader of modern Orthodox Jewry in the 20th century, noted the inverse relationship between our personal mourning and our communal mourning. What happens when we lose a loved one? And a number of us here on the screen right now have lost loved ones, including my wife, Melissa, whose mother passed away 6 weeks ago. We start with the funeral service and the burial, an intense week of Shiva, then another 23 days called Shloshim, and then a year of mourning for our parents. So we start with intensity and we move toward getting back into the world. With Tisha B'Av, it's the exact opposite. Rabbi Soloveitchik notes we start with the 3 weeks where some members of our people limit their activities. They don't go to movies, they don't listen to music, and so on. Then we get to the first of Av, and for 9 days, the tradition is not to eat meat or drink wine or cut your hair. And there are many Jews who observe that. If you had gone to a very traditional under Orthodox supervision meat restaurant the last week, you would have seen menus called the 9 days menus. One restaurant I went to, it may even be the Tokyo Hibachi in Springfield. I think they have the 9 days menu in their regular menu, only for those 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av. So when we complete the fast in 40 minutes, then that's it. We go back to our regular activities. And in fact, our ritual on Tisha B'Av day reflects that, because in synagogues that have a morning service, the one morning a year that you do not wear either a talis or tefillin in the morning service is Tisha B'Av, and then you wear them in the afternoon service. And some of the prayers that we don't recite in the morning, that we're silent about, we add later on in the day. So there's definitely a different atmosphere to Tisha B'Av. And the final thing that I want to say is why I think it's important to observe Tisha B'Av. We were joking, the clergy were joking a couple of weeks ago as we were planning this, that for some Jewish children, the only observance that they know is Tisha B'Av. Why? Because usually they're in camp. And most camps observe Tisha B'Av in one way or another. May not know about Shavuos. You know, I'm joking because they obviously know Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover, but okay, Shavuot's not as well known. Some people don't go to services in Simchat Torah, but any kid who goes to a Jewish camp that has Jewish programming has observed Tisha B'Av. Any of us who've spent a summer in Israel, I'm a graduate of the high school in Israel. I've led USY pilgrimage. We have Nifty here. We have Young Judea. We have all different BBYO, all the different summer programs. In some way or another, you've come face to face with Tisha B'Av. But I think it's important to observe, we have many, many happy occasions in Judaism. We have beautiful holidays with rich customs. We've added what I call the Yamim, Yom HaShoah, which is another sad day in our tradition as we remember the official day of remembrance of the Holocaust, according to the State of Israel, the week after Passover. Then we have Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day of Israel, remembering the 23,500 soldiers and or citizens of Israel, including many Americans and Jews from around the world who have either died fighting for the State of Israel or died in terror attacks, because ever since the Intifadas, they acted, anyone who died in Israel from an act of terror, of which there were many back in the years, end of the 1990s and 2000s. And we have a number of other days of observance. But I do think it's also important to remember the sad times. Tisha B'Av reflects the destruction throughout our history, not only of the two temples, but the many pogroms, the Khmelnytsky pogroms, the riots in Kishinev, and the destruction, the killing of over 50 people in 1903, which led to the very famous poem by the great Israeli poet Chaim Nachman Bialik on the slaughter. there is a whole literature of destruction. And I think on Tisha B'Av, it's incumbent upon us to have this one day. It's the only other 25-hour fast day other than Yom Kippur, that we reflect on the difficult times in our history, but then use that to connect to the wonderful things that we have and continue to do as a Jewish people. So I think it's important for us to observe Tisha B'Av, to have a sense of balance and a sense of responsibility toward the past, but also a responsibility toward the future. In the heart of the middle of this very hot summer, in the middle of a very difficult time in our history and in our country and in our world, I think that by observing Tisha B'Av, it helps us reconnect with the rituals and the history of the past, as we also make a commitment for a beautiful future for our people and our faith. Thank you.
And thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Joel Abraham, a good friend and colleague.
Thank you. Kind of following what Rabbi Kerbel said, Tisha B'Av has always been a challenge to me. Trying to find a way to identify, trying a way to get into this holiday. Some of it, of course, because it does happen in the summer. Even if you are at camp, when you're celebrating it, you're kind of running around and trying to figure out what's going on. In the Reform movement, Tisha B'Av has always been a challenge as well. After all, what Tisha B'Av is mourning is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the reason that the building, the organization that many Reform Jews created is called a temple is because the idea that we are not going to go back to a temple in Jerusalem, that there was a time period when we were all centered in one space, in one land, and there was only one place to truly worship God. But the evolution of time, the way that Judaism has progressed, means that now we create temples in other places that we go. That is just as valid to worship God in the building right behind me or on the green screen right behind me as it is in Jerusalem or other places like that. In fact, in the 1860s platform, which preceded the Pittsburgh platform of Reform Judaism, there was a statement that not only do we not mourn this event, we celebrate it. It's like when your children leave the house. You know, as a parent having a child who's just about to do that, I understand the sadness from the parent's perspective, but from the child's perspective, it is a moment of joy, of freedom, of going out into the world. And that we spend our time growing up as a people and as a religion in the land of Israel throughout the biblical period. And the post-biblical period after the destructions is the time when we actually become an Or L'Goyim, we become a light to the nations. That's when we have to be out in the nations to do that. So for me, it was always a challenge, a kind of that push and pull of how to celebrate Tisha B'Av. And again, I didn't feel that kind of personal tie toward the temple in Jerusalem. And the change with that came not when I spent a year living in Israel and celebrated Tisha B'Av there in Jerusalem, but actually a few years after that, I was in the middle of my rabbinical school career, and there was a rash of church burnings across the South. And one of the professors at my seminary, Rabbi Nancy Weiner, said, let's take a group of students down and travel to one of these churches and help rebuild it. So I went to Bolaji, Alabama. We stayed in a Quaker work camp. So it was a group of Quakers who were bringing people together of all types to kind of do this. And we went to this there were churches that had burned all over the area, 3 or 4 of them, but we worked on one particular project, on one particular church we helped rebuild. And it was an incredibly warm and wonderful experience. The families of this church, and it was a church of, for them, it was 20, 30 families in a church. It's a very small church, but had been a part of them forever. They wouldn't let us bring our own lunches. They insisted on cooking for us. Their hospitality was incredible. And all we were doing was kind of, to my building expertise was putting on spackle and maybe painting or something like that. But we happened to be down there at Tisha B'Av. And so those of us there, led by our rabbinic mentor, a couple of cantorial students and rabbinic students, we decided that we would do our Erev Tisha B'Av service actually not where we were rebuilding the church, because the church did not have building permission to rebuild in the space they had been, but in the place where their church had been burned. And the reason that they couldn't rebuild in the place that they had been for generation after generation was because the practice of this church was the church was in the middle of the lot, and they buried the members of the church around the outside. So it was a church and a graveyard, and the area did not permit them to rebuild a building in an area that had become a graveyard. So we stood on a concrete slab, a flat concrete slab. Some evidence of burning it had happened long enough before they had cleared off with the families, the tombstones of this entire congregation for generation upon generation around us. And I really began to feel at that point what it might mean to lose my home, my spiritual home, my religious home, my generational home. And so that was a lesson I carried with me. When I came back to the United States, I was ordained, and I started at Temple Shalom in Plainfield. Home became a very interesting question as well. My first year, I had a classmate, this was 1999, who had just gone out as the assistant rabbi to the Reformed congregation in Sacramento. And some of you may remember there was an arson fire there that didn't destroy their building, but rendered it uninhabitable for a few months. So wanting to send some kind of message, we did a project in our congregation where I got a chance to get to know the building. I sent members of the congregation, and you may remember this one, we sent members of our congregation to different places in the building where they had a particular tie, somewhere where they spent a very particular moment. And then we gathered each other. We went from space to space to space and grew bigger and bigger and asked each person what their moment was. I think there was some frustration on that journey because some people who we picked up at the end of the journey didn't get to hear the stories at the beginning. And then we came together in our social hall, and we made each person who was there got a square of fabric. And we completed the sentence, a synagogue is a house of, right? Traditionally, we say a synagogue is a house of prayer, a house of gathering, and a house of study. But what is a synagogue really to us? We made this into a quilt, which still hangs today, I believe, in the library of the Sacramento Synagogue. And the question was very turned around for us. We as a congregation had to decide whether we wanted to stay in Plainfield, whether we wanted to move. How much did that building, 90 years of our temple's history, mean to us? What did it mean? Was a synagogue a building? Was a synagogue the people in the community? Who was the real congregation? And in deciding to move, we ended up in rented space without a home really for more than a decade. And now we have the lovely new building, which you can see behind us. And we've really kind of looked at this space. And what does it mean for people who have joined us in this space? People who joined us and we were in the wilderness, people who carried on with us from the whole journey from our previous home. I personally, in my own life, I know about 6-7 years ago, we had a house fire. And because of the house fire, we had to move out of our house. Luckily, my mother lived nearby. She still had a large house, so we didn't have any problems with that. We had insurance, so none of those worries. But people would say to us things like, you know, it's okay, everybody's safe, it's just stuff. But stuff is important. And stuff isn't just stuff. Stuff is also memory. Stuff is things that stuff is tied to, right? The pictures of my children from ages 3 to 5, the varsity jacket I wore in high school, or the jacket I got from my grandfather that I sewed all my Boy Scout patches on, things that were lost in the fire. You know, it's not just the stuff, it's the memories. So taking that back, one of the answers that was given to our ancestors when the temple was destroyed is what happens to the Mikdash? What happens to that sacred place, that location of where we interact with God? And one of the answers the rabbis gave is that what happened was a Mikdash Ma'at, a small sanctuary, a small holy place. And the place that became our small sanctuary was not the synagogues of the rabbis, but the home. The Shabbat table that we set, having the 2 chalot and the candles, is really a reminder of the 2 sacrifices that were given in the temple on Shabbat. So we have transformed that Mikdash in Jerusalem, that temple, to the place of our home. And so what I wanted to leave you is this very weird moment that we are in today, which is that we have not lost our Mikdash Ma'at, our small sanctuaries. In fact, just the opposite. We have been trapped in our small sanctuaries. We've lost the outside world. We've lost perhaps the ability to go to our synagogues and to gather together with our community, but we've kept this small sanctuary in our own homes. So as we think about this on Tisha B'Av, what it means to lose your home, what it means to be trapped in your home, I thought it was an interesting way to look at our Mikdash Ma'at. Remember what we were grateful for, and remember sometimes it's you lose your home, and sometimes you lose everything outside.
Thank you, Rabbi Abraham. Now I would like to take a few moments and study a little bit of Lamentations, Echa in Hebrew, which is one of the main texts that we look to on Tisha B'Av. So before we look at the text itself, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background around the text. Lamentations comes from the third section of the Hebrew Bible, known as Ketuvim, or writings in English. And it's one of the 5 Megillot, or scrolls, and it is associated, as the scrolls are, with a specific holiday, of course, being Tisha B'Av. Who wrote the book? We ascribe it generally to the prophet Jeremiah. And it's an interesting conclusion to the prophet's life's work. By nature, Jeremiah was not necessarily a harsh critic. He was kind and caring, but because of his times, he became a prophet of doom and destruction. In fact, he lived to see some of the destruction that he predicted. The theme for Lamentations, of course, is the destruction of Judea, Jerusalem, the temple. It also includes a confession of the sins of the people and a prayer that God might again look in favor upon Israel and restore us. And of course, it concludes with the verse that we're very familiar with, Hashivenu, which we'll get to. A little bit about the structure of Lamentations, which is quite interesting. It is 5 chapters long, and each chapter is seen as a self-contained unit. And 4 of the 5 poems, or 4 of the 5 chapters, are alphabetical in structure. So let me share my screen with you, if I can. And let's see. There. Okay. So hopefully you can all see my screen. This is courtesy of Safaria. So if you look at Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 1, of course, it begins with Echa. The second verse begins, so that Echa begins with Aleph. Verse 2 begins with Bet. Verse 3 begins with Gimel. So if you're familiar with the Hebrew, you know those are the first 3 letters in order of the Hebrew alphabet. And interestingly, the way the book is written, chapters 1, 2, and 4 all have 22 verses, and they all are alphabetical going through the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 5 also has 22 verses, but it's not alphabetical. And chapter 3 has 66 verses with 3 repetitions of the alphabet. So how purposeful is this structure? What is the point of that? Most believe that the alphabetical form was used so that people could memorize the book, especially at a time when people did not have easy access to printed material. Lamentations also uses short clauses, which are not usually found in Hebrew verse. So they're actually, scholars and commentators look at these verses and believe that, especially as we get further into the book, that they're designed to give the impression of sobs, as if someone is crying. So let's take a brief look at some of the verses to give us an idea of the tone or the message of Echa. Now we can see right from the start, alas, lonely sits the city, once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is become a thrall. So here right away we get this imagery. And of course they're talking, Jeremiah is talking about Jerusalem here. And we can imagine that Jerusalem must at one time have been an incredibly busy, vibrant city. And here, Jerusalem, once the center of religious worship, sits idle, and the emptiness is striking. The author compares Jerusalem to a widow. And it's interesting, this of the idea of the image of a widow is used frequently in biblical literature as an image for loneliness or sadness. What's interesting is that the text holds out a little bit of hope here, because it doesn't say she has become a widow. She is like a widow, which is a hint that there is an opportunity for hope in this. And as we look at verse 2, we can see, bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheeks wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. When we think of the nighttime, we think of natural silence, and this is when the sound of weeping is heard even more poignantly. It's not drowned out by other people talking, by people moving, by the noise of commerce. So the weeping is even louder at night. It is all the more upsetting. Rashi, the commentator, imagines actually that the temple was destroyed at night. And one of Jeremiah's favorite phrases is about friends and lovers departing someone. And he uses that term here, and that they have formed alliances against her, clearly from the events that took place. And if we go to verse 3, we'll see Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. And again, we have this idea of Israel in exile, sadness, oppression, and finding no rest anywhere. And this idea of no rest is actually interesting, because this is harkens back a little bit to the portion of Noah where the dove goes out to find some dry land, but the dove can find no place to rest its foot. So this is an image that we have seen used before in Torah. We'll move on a little bit to chapter 3. And here you can see these very short verses, which seem to imply the sobs of Israel, of Jerusalem. But as much as the text up until now has been filled with sadness, we see that in verse 21, there is an opportunity for hope. But this do I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The kindness of the Lord has not ended. His mercies are not spent. So we see that one can set no limits to God's mercies. They are inexhaustible. In verse 25, we read, the Lord is good to those who trust in him, to the ones who seek him, implying that if we look for God, we will, of course, ultimately find God. As we go through this elegy that is now turned hopeful, we come to verse 40. Let us search and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. So here we have the opportunity presented to us to examine our behavior and look toward a future that is reconciled with God. And of course, the idea that God will take us back. And if we go toward the very end of the book, we see the chapter 5, verse 21, that we are all familiar with. Hashivenu Adonai elecha, v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old. This, as we know, is the refrain that we often hear this time of the year as we think about teshuvah and repentance and returning to what should be a very close relationship to God and to those around us from which we may feel alienated right now. The next verse, for truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days of old. In traditional settings, when we read this publicly, we often read verse 21, verse 22, and then 21 again, so that we can end on a positive note. What I'd like to do is share a kind of a modern take on this with you. Let's see if I can pull that up. Don't know if I have it. Let's see. Nope, that's not it. I do not have it. But I think that a modern take on this sort of reminds us that Lamentations was certainly, though it is an old text, is a text for our time today. When we think of a city that is deserted, when we think of a place bereft of its people, of its normal commerce that happens day in and day out, we certainly can imagine that Echa could have been written for a time like today, when so much of our world has changed. Echa reflects the idea of a world suddenly interrupted, of life not going on as we know it. And so in a poignant way this year, Tisha B'Av and Echa resonate in a way that they may not have for us in years past. We may not have longed for the rebuilding of a temple. We may not all have longed to return to Jerusalem in that very visceral way, but certainly the today, Tisha B'Av and Lamentations speak to us in a new, more intimate way, in a way that we can understand these texts and almost imagine what it might have been like for our ancestors in a way that we may not have been able to have imagined that before. So thank you for taking a look at the book of Lamentations with me. And now it is my pleasure to invite Rabbi Howard Tillman to teach us.
Great, thank you, Rabbi Appel, Rabbi Abraham, Rabbi Karbel, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening as we conclude this observance of Tisha B'Av in a way, and for a day that really felt very different this year than any other. I'm actually going to begin where I thought I was going to end. That's just how we adjust on the fly, which is really the same verse that Rabbi Appel was just speaking about, that concluding verse of Megillat Echa, of the book of Lamentations. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh Yameinu kekedem. Again, we frequently hear that at the end of the Torah service as we are closing the ark, as we are returning the Torah to it, and there it really fits contextually. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. As we return the Torah, we hope to be able to come back. As we're reading this verse last night, though, as I was sitting in a mostly empty sanctuary, wearing a face mask in the dark and looking at 20 or so faces on a screen, the verse, though, struck me in a very different way. As we say, take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Part of that this year felt to me as if a call, let us come back. Let us come back to a sanctuary. Let us come back to a space that we know is sacred, that we know is holy, that we know is a place where we can be together. And again, renew our days as of old. When can we go back to the way things were? When can we go back to our lives of 4 or 5 months ago? When can we go back to the freedom of moving around, the freedom of seeing whom we wanted and doing what we wanted? When can we get back to normal again? And as I thought about that, I began thinking that in some ways this did feel very much like a moment of transition that our ancestors faced. As Rabbi Kerbel began by explaining, again, Tisha B'Av recognizes and is really the days of mourning for the destructions of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and then the second temple by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era. And each of those events, particularly the second one, was a major calamity and totally changed the way of life and really the course of all of Jewish history from that moment forward. And we can say that now, and we can say now we're grateful for the events that have transpired since then. We're grateful that we've focused on a rabbinic Judaism, on prayer, on study, on acts of loving kindness and chesed and mitzvot, and not so much on animal sacrifice in only one place in the temple. But that wasn't always the case, and particularly for our ancestors who lived through those moments of destruction or who were living in the days shortly after, it was no doubt in easy transition. And there were moments for them of looking to go back to the way things were and looking to go back to what normal life was and to go back to normal, to go back to their sanctuary, to go back to the temple. And it was a process to understand that that was not possible and that was not going to happen, and to have to then adapt and adjust. And there is a short story, there is a short passage from the Talmud that I think speaks to exactly that moment that we're just going to take a brief look at as we pull it up just on our screens here. And you see here I have, again, that verse, Hashivenu Adonai Alecha v'nashuva. I have this at the bottom of my document to prove that, yes, that was where I was going to end, but we adjusted it to the beginning. But this story sets itself up really in the days, again, following the destruction of the second temple, and it picks up with a citation. The sages taught when the temple was destroyed a second time. So this is again the just after the year 70 CE. There was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews, whose practice was to not eat meat and to not drink wine. So if we know our little bit of our Jewish history, we know that at the time of the destruction of the second temple, there were some different really main groups within the Jewish community. There were the Pharisees, who were primarily the rabbinic class, the Sadducees, which were the priestly class. There were the Zealots, who were the uprisers who really fought back and rebelled against the Romans. And then there was this fourth group known as the Essenes, whom we think of mostly today as the group that left the city of Jerusalem, went and lived in the caves overlooking the Dead Sea, and whom we attribute the Dead Sea Scrolls to. Now, their lives were very different. Their observance of Jewish tradition was very different, and many of them living in caves in the desert, partially out of necessity, adopted more of an ascetic lifestyle where they did not eat meat and did not drink wine. So Rabbi Yehoshua, one of the great rabbis of the age, comes to them to discuss their practice. And he said to them, "My children, for what reason do you not eat meat and do you not drink wine?" They said to him, "Shall we eat meat from which offerings are sacrificed upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist?" So to put another way, how can we eat meat when we used to sacrifice meat on the altar? This was our most sacred of ritual, and we can no longer do it. How can we possibly continue to eat meat? And they go on, "Shall we drink wine, which was poured as a libation offering upon the altar, and now that altar has also ceased to exist? How can we drink wine that was also used for our sacred rituals that we can no longer take part in? These two items of meat and wine we can just simply cannot eat. They remind us too much of our sacred ways that are now lost." So how does Rabbi Yehoshua respond to them? He says to them, "Well, I understand that. I understand where you're coming from, So if so, we will not eat bread either, since the meal offerings, the grain offerings that were offered upon the altar have ceased. Say, well, if that's your line of thinking, well, we can't eat grain, we can't eat bread either. And they said, well, you're correct, but it's possible to subsist with produce. Well, we don't need bread. They were the first people to go low carb, to go gluten free, and they said we can just eat produce. Well, he said to them, well, we will not eat produce either, since the bringing of the first fruits has ceased. The first fruits, the Bikurim offering that we commemorate on Shavuot, that offering is also no longer possible. So they said, well, you're correct. We'll no longer eat the produce of the Shivat Haminim, the 7 species that were native to the land of Israel from which the first fruits were brought, as it's possible to subsist with other produce. So we don't have to eat those fruits, but we can just have other fruits and vegetables. And he says to them, well, if so, we will not drink water, since the water libation, a special offering that took place on the holiday of Sukkot, since that has ceased as well. At this point, how did they respond? They were silent, as they realized they could not survive without water. So they realized, as Rabbi Yehoshua pointed out to them, that if we are going to base everything that we're doing on the ways things were, on what we once were able to do, if all we are building ourselves up around is trying to get back to the way things were, we won't live at all. We can't have meat, wine, produce, grain, or water. And without water, we cannot survive. It's simply no way to live. So he goes on to tell them, Rabbi Yehoshua said to them, my children, come and I will tell you how we should act. To not mourn at all is impossible, as a decree was already issued and the temple has been destroyed. But to mourn excessively, as you're doing, is also impossible, as the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it, saying, we can't live this way, the way that you are. It's simply not livable for the majority of the people, and we won't have an edict, we won't have a ruling, a decree, unless we know people will be able to abide by it. So the way you're living is no way to live. But yes, we still have to mourn. And not to mourn at all is impossible, as we've decreed the temple is destroyed and we should be mournful of it and be mindful of it, but also to base everything that we're doing around mourning for that is also not impossible. So what does he say? Rabbi Yeshua continues, and this is more of the aside. This comes up in the context where it was about, that this is what the sages said. A person may plaster his house with plaster, but he must leave over a small amount in it without plaster to remember the destruction of the temple. That's the context that this story actually came up in. They were discussing how to build a house and the tradition of not having the entire house plastered out of memory of the temple. So Rabbi Yehoshua's point, I think, is important, and I think is valid for all of us to remember, in that, yes, for looking back from the days of the temple, we again mourn it. We recognize that it was an important part of our life. We recognize that those sacred rituals are no longer possible, but we cannot base our entire existence on that. We cannot withhold ourselves from participating in any form of living simply out of mourning for what we once had. We have to find a way to continue living. We have to find a way to adapt to our new surroundings, to our new times. As I thought about that story, again, in context of this final verse of Eicha, of Lamentations, and take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days of old. And as I, again, sat there last night, mask on my face in an empty sanctuary, thinking to myself, oh, how can we go back to the way things were? When will we be able to have that moment again? I think this story reminded me a little bit that, again, yes, of course, we long for that day. Yes, we look to go back to the way things were, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge how things are, and we have to acknowledge the realities that we all face and that we're all trying to live with and that we're all trying to struggle with. So if that does mean again, wearing a mask when we're out and about, so be it. That's the equivalent of leaving a house without a little bit of plaster on it. If that means not being able to go everywhere I want, but really trying to be conscious of where I'm able to and when I'm able to, I think that's part of it as well. And that, yes, we still long for the days as things were. We still long to be able to return to our sanctuaries and to our communities, to our friends, to our family. At the same time, we find ways of adapting, and we find ways of gathering together as we do tonight here on Zoom. We find ways of gathering together remotely, virtually, wearing masks, socially distanced, and find our way of adapting to our present realities. We still hope to be able to come back. We still hope that, again, this will not be our entire existence. This will not be everything for many more days. But we look to find ways of still making the best of it as we are now, and finding ways to continue living and to continue recognizing the times that we're in. That was my realization for observing Tisha B'Av this year, and again in a totally new experience. As we said, introducing ourselves, many of my own Tisha B'Av experiences were held at camp, particularly again in settings where everyone around is practicing, and I still have images of lit. I don't even know what the right English words is for it, but little torch lights leading the way as we come into to observe the holiday and to read Eicha together. And not being able to do that, I think, really hit home for many of us this year. But I still hope that as we come to really now the conclusion of our day, we found moments for reflection. We found moments to acknowledge where we were and to be mournful and mindful of that which came before us, but at the same time, looking to how we can adapt and how we can continue on in our future. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to turn it back to Rabbi Appel. Am I turning it right over to Rabbi Kerbel?
Thank you, Rabbi Tillman. We enjoyed your teaching, and yes, we're going to turn it over to Rabbi Kerbel. Rabbi, unmute yourself.
Do we have a text for people to see with the service on it? If not, I'll just do it and you'll say Amen, okay? And those, at least from our congregation, will probably have the Siddur, Sim Shalom in front of them.
And I can put one up if you start. I can have it up in a minute.
Okay. Page 137 in the Siddur, or any evening service in any prayer book you have. ולא יאיר כל חמתו, אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו, ביום קראנו, ברכו את אדוני המבורך, ברוך אדוני המבורך, לעולם ועד. אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב ערבים, אהבת עולם בישראל. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל. We join together in the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. V'yahavta et Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha, u'b'chol nafshecha, u'b'chol me'odecha, v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele, asher anochi mitzavecha, Hayom al levavecha, v'shinantam levanecha, v'dibarta bam, v'shiftecha b'veitecha, u'v'lechtecha v'derech, u'v'shachbecha, u'v'kumecha, u'kshartam leot al yadecha, v'hayu letotafot ben einecha, Uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvish arecha. We continue silently with the second and third paragraphs of the Shema, 138 and 139. V'haya im shema tishma'u. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim lihiyot lachem le'Elohim. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Adonai Elohechem emet. Toward the bottom of the page. V'malchuto baratzon kiblu alehem Moshe u'vnei Yisrael lecha anu shira B'simcha rabba v'yamru chulam Michamocha ba'elim Adonai Michamocha nedar b'kodesh Norah tehilot osef daleh Malchutecha u'vanecha Bokei yam lifnei Moshe ze'eli anu v'yamru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed v'ne'emar kifad Adonai Yaakov ugilo miyad chazak mimenu baruch ata Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. Page 140, we'll recite the English, the Hashkivenu. Rabbi Tillman will recite the English. Yes. 140, please join me. Help us, Adonai, to lie down in peace and awaken us again, our sovereign, to life. Spread over us your shelter of peace. Guide us with your good counsel. Save us because of your mercy. Shield us from enemies and pestilence, from starvation, sword, and sorrow. Remove the evil forces that surround us. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, O God, who watches over us and delivers us, our gracious and merciful ruler. Guard our coming and our going. Grant us life and peace now and always. Praised are you, Adonai, eternal guardian of your people, Israel. Baruch atah Adonai, shomer amo Yisrael la'ad. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen v'amen. Baruch Adonai bayom, Baruch Adonai bayom. Ki hamachut shelcha hi ulameatim loch bechavod, ki ein lanu melech ela ata, Baruch ata Adonai hamelech bichodo, tamidim loch aleinu le'olam ba'ed v'al kol ma'asav. I will stand for the Chatzi Kaddish, and following the Kaddish, we recite the Amidah silently, pages 142 to 148. Please feel free to add your own private prayers and meditations. Yikadav yikadash shemei Rabbi, Yamad yivrach Yerutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon uv'yom echon, uv'chayedecho beit Yisrael, v'agalav yizman kariv yimru, amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevorach le'olam omei omaya, yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitpoar v'yitroman v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudesha b'rechu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, damiran b'yama v'yimru. Amen. Again, we recite the silent meditation, the Amidah, 142 to 148 in the Hebrew or the English, or your own private prayers and meditations. For those who are still reciting the Amidah, please continue at your own pace. We'll conclude the Amidah with the words of Oseh Shalom, which you'll find on this
Hi.
page in the text.
Hi. So
One.
are you still in the service?
Yes, I am. I'll call you back in a few.
Oh, sorry.
That's up now.
What? Oseh Shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Page 149, the Reader's Kaddish, followed by Aleinu on 150. Yikadav Yikadav Shemei Rabba Be'alma Divrach Yerutei V'yamlich Machutei V'chayechon Uv'yomechon Uv'chayedecho Beit Yisrael Ba'agalav Izman Kariv Yimru Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Omei Omaya Yeparach V'yishtabach V'yitpoar V'yitramam V'yitnaseh V'yitadar V'yitalev V'yitalal Shmei Dekudesha B'riachu Le'elam Min Kol Birchata V'shirata Tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran bi'alma v'yimru amen. Tikabel tzlot honu v'adechon decho Yisrael, kadam v'hon dishmaya v'yimru amen. Yeshlam rabba min shemai v'chayim, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, la'tei kedula liotzer bereshit, shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, v'lo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chalkenu kahem, v'goralenu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, u'mishtachavim u'modim, Lifnei melech malchei hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shehut Hashemayim. Kakatu b'toratech Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed, v'ne'emar v'haya Adonai le'melech al kol ha'aretz. Bayom ha'hu, Yihye Adonai echad, U'shemo echad. We recall with affection those who no longer walk this earth. We are grateful to God for the gift of their lives, for their companionship, and for the cherished memories that endure. In tribute to our beloved ones, we invite those who are in mourning or those observing your site to join now in the words of the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, B'alma divrach Yerutei, V'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechon, uv'yomechon, uv'chayedecho Beit Yisrael, ba'agala uv'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevorach, le'olam olmei omaya. Yeparach v'yishtabach, V'yitpoar, v'yitromam, v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar, v'yitaleh, v'yitalal, shemeda kudushav, v'richu, la'ela minkol, birchata, v'shirata, tushbechata, v'nechamata, da'amiran bi'alma, bi'imru, amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu bi'al kol Yisrael, amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu, ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu bi'al kol Yisrael, b'yimaru. Amen. Well, thank you all very much for being with us this evening. It was a very enjoyable learning experience. And I personally found it very meaningful that we were all together. Please give your feedback to your individual clergy and rabbis. And Rabbi Pell, if you have any concluding words. Thank you to Jackie for being our manager for tonight.
Thank you all. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that our observance of Tisha B'Av was made so much more meaningful by being all together, by taking this opportunity to study with each other, to worship with each other. And I hope that everyone enjoys good health and wellness. And since it's Thursday night, it's not too early to wish you all a Shabbat filled with shalom and peace and wholeness. And I think we all look forward to more opportunities to be together again. Thank you all.
Thank you. Maybe we should do Rosh Hashanah together. Maybe that'd be the easiest solution. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. With breakout rooms,
Right.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. It was very inspiring.
Great.
You're welcome.
Nice to see everybody. Nice. Oh, Cranford. Okay. In Cranford. Oh, that's a conservative. Bye. Bye. Bye, Jackie.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
That Cranford rabbi, he's so nice. See you, Victor.
Bye, Joel. Take care.